Three men found themselves in a fiery trap, and the fire was spreading faster and faster. And although the library could no longer be saved, the old man still shouted to one of the guys to take out the hard drive on which all the books were stored. The guy found himself between the shelves of books quite quickly, since he had a good sense of direction and was able to get the hard drive out intact and undamaged. But the joy was short-lived because at that very moment, a falling iron pipe began to creak over the young man's head. The metal structure was massive and heavy, which is why the young man didn't have a single chance, and he only managed to turn around before dying. The librarian suddenly sat up in bed as if from a bad dream and screamed at the last image of his life flashing before his eyes, and him being crushed to death by a metal pipe. But not only did the guy end up alive, he also ended up in a completely different place. And looking around, he didn't understand at all where exactly he was now. Before the young man had time to figure out where he was and how he ended up there, he looked at himself and did not recognize his body or the clothes he was wearing. The guy, without recovering from the state of shock and surprise, received a new portion of the incomprehensible, and a scroll appeared in front of him, radiating a golden glow, and announced in a human voice that this is a world where the path of the literary Tao is valued. The scroll continued to answer the young man's questions and said that this world had taken a different path since the time of Confucius. So such great poets and lyricists as Cao Cao and Cao Ji, as well as Li Bai and Du Fu, had never existed here. The scroll unfurled to reveal the disciples of Confucius, whom he had recruited after creating the 6 books, and through which the path of the literary Tao was opened, which later spread, and thus Confucius became the first saint among men. 5 disciples of Confucius appeared before the guy's eyes, and the scroll named each of them and explained that they, having inherited the teachings of the Way, also rose to the ranks of saints in order to defend this world. Since the librarian was well-read, he was shocked to find himself in a world where people began to revere the path of literary Tao, considering martial arts to be crude. The scroll confirmed the guy's thoughts and indicated that indeed in this world people are called readers or masters of the path of literature, and they, cultivating this path, discover the palace of literature within themselves. The voice from the scroll told the young man that the 9th stage of the master is good reading, which significantly strengthens the body and grants ease of movement. The 8th stage of the master of the literary Tao path is characterized by the unification of writing and body, and at this stage the words of such masters become a powerful spell. At the 7th stage, a blade-like letter opens and a master with such abilities becomes a warrior whose word could strike no worse than a weapon. Finally, the voice clarified that in this world, people talented in the field of literature were like the owners of Maliang's magic brush and could destroy an army or restore prosperity to the entire world with just one word. After his explanation, Scroll addressed the guy as his master, saying that now he was like a system to him and that he could request information from the archives of the National Library at any time. The system also specified that the owner could touch it so that the memories of the previous owner of this body would return to him, and the librarian finally realized that this was the same hard drive that had now become his system. The guy looked at the source containing the works of brilliant writers of antiquity and was glad to realize that this archive was next to him in a world where cultivators of the path of literature are valuable. The joy of having such a tool at hand also gave the young man the idea that he essentially had everything he needed to climb to the top of this world. And after that, he touched the scroll to return the body's memories. Bright rays began to swirl from the scroll to the guy's head like incense smoke, thus returning the memories of the old body to the mind of the new hero. The young man's eyes opened wide as all the memories were loaded, which allowed him to feel like he was truly in another body. The guy looked at his hands again, just like the first time he saw them after he woke up. But now the sensations were different. The memories came back just in time because the door to the house opened and bright sunlight shone through it and someone was standing at the entrance. The girl was bringing food to her younger brother and smiling that he had finally woken up. And the guy already knew that this was his older brother's daughter-in-law, Liu Jiyin, who'd gone off to war on the 2nd day after the wedding, and there had been no news for 5 years. Liu told her younger brother Li Chang'an that this time he became so ill that he lay unconscious for 3 days. The sister sat down next to him and asked that his brother must be very hungry, handed him a bowl, asking him to be careful because the drink was hot, and the guy responded to the smile with a smile and, thanking him, took the bowl in his hands. But Li was surprised when he looked at the contents of the bowl, because it seemed like there was just ordinary water in there. Sister Leo noticed her younger brother's reaction and, dejected, explained that their wine was not being sold at all, and that the money that was left was spent on medicinal herbs and porridge for Li. The guy looked at Liu and, realizing that things were bad, suspected that his sister had most likely deprived herself and asked if she had eaten. Liu responded with a look and, embarrassed that she was lying, but did not want to make her brother worry, said that she had eaten. Li saw that his sister had already started to cry and tried to explain something, but the lump in his throat wouldn't let him. So he told her that there shouldn't be secrets between relatives. The girl could barely utter anything again. So Li, without hesitation, poured the drink into another bowl, dividing it in half. The brother gave a piece of bread to his sister, suggesting that they eat together, thereby calming the girl down and the tears stopped flowing from her eyes. Liu was filled with gratitude towards her younger brother, and with a smile on her face, she turned around and accepted his offer. The brother and sister sat next to each other and continued to talk, sharing this modest meal with each other, and despite the circumstances, both were smiling. Li asked where the younger Linglong was, who in the memories was Liu Ziyin's 17-year-old sister, meaning she was a year younger than Li. Liu was ready to sink into the ground because this time her lie was even more obvious, and the girl replied that the baby had returned to their mother's house. The bowl of drink stopped at Li's mouth because his sister's answer made him surprised and doubtful at the same time. The younger brother looked closely at his sister and, indicating that he had problems with his lungs and not with his head, asked her to tell the truth. Liu began to cry again, and covering her mouth with her hand, barely audibly replied that Linglong sold herself to the House of 100 Fragrances in order to get money for her brother's treatment. The guy felt a mixture of anger, fear, and shock from the situation, and he shouted to his sister that this was a brothel. Li immediately jumped out of bed in order to take some action without even thinking about it, and completely forgetting that the mind is one and the body is another. This is exactly what played a cruel joke on the guy, and his legs, not obeying their owner, gave way from weakness without even taking a step. Li fell to his knees from the helplessness and weakness of his sick body, and his sister rushed to his aid, reminding him that he had only just woken up. Full of determination, Li looked at the girl and said that he had a duty to free his younger sister Linglong no matter what. Liu helped the boy up and explained that the people from the House of 100 Fragrances had set a condition for her to deposit 300 taels of silver by the end of the month because otherwise Linglong would start serving customers. And the girl began to cry bitter tears again because with their current state of affairs, contributing such a sum was impossible. Li rose to his feet and stood firmly, placing his hand on his sister's shoulder, showing that he supported her and everyone who touched their family. The guy looked into the girl's tear-stained eyes and said that he would cope with this problem no matter what it cost him and asked Liu not to worry. Finally, the brother indicated that he would definitely come up with a way to bring his younger sister back and promised that she would not be harmed, which again calmed Liu down and gave her hope. It was already dark, but Li headed to the house where the wine was stored in order to solve two problems at once, with the products and with the return of his sister. From his memories, the guy knew that the Li family was involved in winemaking, and at one time things were going really well, but something happened that threw both the production and the winemakers off track. The business came to naught because first his father and older brother went to war, and then Li was struck by illness, and there was no one left to deal with wine. The guy opened one of the barrels and realized that he needed to start by trying what the wine tasted like, and from that draw a conclusion in which direction to move on. Li scooped up the drink with a special ladle and tasted it carefully in order to evaluate the product, in the production of which mistakes had clearly been made. Li concluded that there were a lot of impurities in the wine, but despite this, the aroma was very weak, which indicated the low quality of the wine, and accordingly, in this case, the required amount would not be collected by the end of the month. But the guy wasn't discouraged, because he had an ace up his sleeve in the form of a system that clearly contained information about winemaking. The librarian approached the system with a request to show him how to make ergatu, which was prepared by double distillation from sorghum grain and was quite strong. But learning the cooking method didn't last long because Li was distracted by the scream of his older sister, which was heard somewhere from the street. The large man pestered Liu, ignoring the girl's reluctance to be near him, and Li just ran to the gate to help. The rude Wanner Gu grabbed Liu's hand, insisting that she had no need to mess around with that weakling brother, since he had almost died forcing her to go with him. But the girl resisted and screamed for him to let her go. Li came out of the gate and pointed his finger at the scoundrel, telling him to leave his sister alone, showing with his whole appearance that he was talking about this quite seriously. The guy no longer looked weak, as many had become accustomed to seeing him recently, and his eyes showed a real threat to the one who was threatening his family. When Lee saw that the freak was not getting the words and warnings, he took the first thing that came to hand, and it was a brick. Gu noticed that the guy was different now and really wasn't joking, so he let go of Liu and backed away to his cart. Warner was a neighbor who was engaged in winemaking, and before the librarian appeared in Lee's body, there was no one to protect the girl. So the scoundrel took advantage of his position, but now he retreated for the first time. Lee calmly warned Gu to return to where he was going, which made his words sound even more menacing than if it had been a shout. But the neighbor remained standing in place, and then the guy raised a brick and, pointing at the cart, repeated again that if Gu did not leave, the jugs of wine would be broken. The neighbor wanted to object to Lee's words, but the guy raised the brick even higher, thereby showing that he would really break all the jugs. Gu turned to his cart and irritably shouted that he was leaving, while uttering a bunch of swear words to the guy, but Lee continued to hold the brick at the ready. Having moved away to a safe distance, Gu shouted that he would still take the girl for himself when Lee finally died, which terribly angered the guy. Although Liu was grateful to her brother, when she approached, she was alarmed that he had acted in such a way, insulting that person, trying to say that this was at least some hope for the opportunity to sell wine. The younger brother didn't even listen to the end of why that freak was important, and answered his sister that people like him don't understand the good way, and Liu again wanted to convince him otherwise, but burst into tears. The guy convinced Liu not to worry because he would make sure that that person wouldn't harm her again. Chang'an carefully took Liu's hand in his own, showing his support not only in words, but also by the fact that he was really there and ready to help. Li looked at his sister and promised that from now on, he would protect both her and himself, not allowing anyone to bully them, and also added that he had already figured out how to get little Linglong back. In the morning, Chang'an showed Liu his design for making wine and explained that he learned it from an ancient book. The girl, having smelled the aroma coming from the stream of drink, could not believe how aromatic and enticing it was. Liu looked at the barrel of drink, realizing that even just by smell and appearance, this was the best wine she had seen in all of Lin County. The older sister didn't drink alcohol, but the smell was so enticing that even she couldn't resist at least one sip. The girl's eyes filled with tears again from the realization that they could actually save the younger Linglong and bring her home. Liu rushed to hug her younger brother with tears in her eyes, which caught the guy by surprise because he did not understand what was wrong with her. The girl, wiping away tears of happiness, said that Chang'an is amazing, and she doesn't even know how to thank it now. Although Li was a brother to this girl in this world, at the same time he was also a librarian who was essentially a stranger to her, which made him embarrassed by Liu's words. Having prepared a small amount of wine, the brother and sister went to the western area of the Lin County wine market and actively offered their drink to passers-by for tasting. Liu picked up the jug and asked a guy passing by if he would like to try some wine. But he, seeing that it was the Li family, replied that he was not interested. The girl tried to convince the young man that this was a completely new wine, but this only made him angry and he quickly walked away. The sister was upset both from the fatigue of standing at the market since early morning and from the fact that they had not yet sold a single jug of wine, and suggested lowering the price to begin with. Li realized that the deal was bad and he had only recently appeared in this body, so he agreed to try to lower the price. Gu's neighbor was heading towards the boys, mocking their price of 20 coins for one jug, despite their recent conversation with Li. Of course, Gu didn't give a damn about the guy, because this time he wasn't alone, but with his workers, and in a humiliating manner, he pointed out that he wouldn't have taken this lousy wine for free. It doesn't take a lot of people to have fun, and after hearing Gu make fun of the Li family and their wine, people joined in and started laughing too. Liu wanted to say something to her brother, but he stood in front of her and told her not to be afraid of anything because he was nearby. Gu came close to Chang'an and, calling him a pathetic corpse, threw him a few coins, offering to sell the winery along with his older sister and take the money for medicine to last maybe another week. Li silently accepted the words of this clown and did not even glance at the money that fell down, but only continued to stand with the jug in his hands. But when Gu approached his sister and grabbed her hand again, it worked like a red rag to a bull for the guy. Chang'an immediately moved towards the dog, who had not understood the previous warning that evening, and said that he was now dead. Jumping over Gu's head and swinging hard, Li smashed a full jug of wine on the freak's head, something he didn't expect at all. Gu had not yet had time to recover from the blow to the head when Li immediately delivered another blow to his huge stomach with his foot, from which the big guy was thrown to the side. Lying on the ground, Gu began to bleat in his defense that this little bastard attacked him on the territory of the wine market. Lee continued to stand in front of Wanner while he barely got to his feet, complaining that he would report what happened to Lord Qingtian. The guy did not lag behind the pathetic winemaker and, falling on the fool, said that the jug simply slipped from his hands right onto Gu's stupid head, and he had no evidence against it, which greatly outraged the big guy, and he said that all the people saw what happened. While the men were arguing about who started the squabble, the intoxicating aroma of new wine was already emanating from the broken jug. And instead of watching the squabble, people were now inhaling the sweet aroma, discussing whether it was coming from that jug of the Lee family. One of Gu's workers told his boss that the Lee family's wine had become more fragrant according to people who smelled it. Since the contents of the jug spilled onto the winemaker after it broke, he sniffed and also smelled the same smell. The unpleasant incident turned out to be beneficial for the brother and sister, and people approached them praising the drink and its aroma and asking if they could try it. Lee didn't expect everything to turn out like this at all, and before he answered and became happy, he paused a little. A moment later, the younger brother asked his sister to bring another jug of wine, glad that despite the squabble, they still managed to attract people. Chang'an and Liu poured wine for people to try, and the guy said that it was the Erguotu variety brewed by their Li family. Potential buyers came up to try the wine one after another and could not stop enjoying such a truly wonderful drink. One of the men who tasted the wine could not contain his delight, so he shouted out that it was the most delicious wine he had ever tasted. Almost everyone who tried the wine said they wanted to buy a jug, and some asked for two at once. And Gu, who had previously sold only his own wine and had no direct competitors, was angry at such humiliation. When Liu turned to those wishing to buy wine with a piece of paper on which it was written whose drink it was, the buyers could not believe that the Li family's reputation had been restored and at first even had some doubts. But Chang'an now guaranteed the quality of the product made by his family, and his sister standing next to him confirmed this. One of the buyers agreed to take 10 gins of the Li family's wine, but set the condition that if the next batch of the drink was of worse quality, not only would he not buy it, but he would also tell all his friends about the failure. While Chang'an was thanking the customer for the order, Gu stood to the side the whole time and heard the conversation between the Li family and those who wanted to try and buy their drink, do everything to ensure that that scoundrel Li could not sell a drop of his wine. The next day, as promised, Chang'an gave 10 gin of fresh wine when a customer came to him after yesterday's tasting. The young man was very happy with the promptness of the order when suddenly Gu came running from behind with his cart and wine, asking the man to wait. Neither the seller nor the buyer expected such a turn of events, so they both froze in anticipation of what would happen next. Putting a fake smile on his face, Gu turned to the customer, reminding him that he had already ordered 50 gins of wine from him yesterday and that they were already ready and standing in front of him. In order to sweeten his already sticky speech, Wanner decided to resort to trickery and prepared a couple more extra gins. The winemaker said that this extra couple of gins of wine did not require payment from the buyer, which was how he was able to really bribe the man. The customer turned slightly towards Lee because it was difficult for him to choose between the orders. And the problem was that in their hotel they do not drink more than 60 gins of wine per day. Gu, without missing the opportunity, leaned over and quietly told the customer that in that case, he should just return the wine to Lee and, like a snake, continued to whisper that the wine could be bad and could ruin the business. At that moment, Chang'an was analyzing his neighbor's behavior in the form of toadyism and extra gins of wine, and, in addition, once again slandering their family out of thin air. The guy took a firm step forward and quoted the great Confucius, who once said that he does not know what a person who cannot be trusted is good for, and whether a glow has appeared around him. Both Gu and the customer were taken aback by this sight, because even a simple winemaker, and one who is also weak in health, can be one of the greats, able to use words as a weapon. And Chang'an continued to say that if a man so easily went back on his word, he would never be able to be a decent person in society. Finally, Lee said, as if delivering the decisive blow, that just one human word could be worth thousands of gold. The men's necks were wrapped in chains, making it difficult for them to breathe, and they were unable to move their arms and legs for the same reason. From the outside, it seemed that nothing was happening, and the chains were not visible, but Lee realized that in this world, the word really has great power, because Gu was holding his throat and trying to catch his breath, apologizing for his words, and the customer was ready to buy all the wine from Lee. Since the guy used his knowledge for the first time and saw the word in action on living people, the sight surprised him. Chang'an looked at his hands and was delighted to realize that he was now able to teach two people a lesson at once without doing anything. Behind the customer and Gu, someone loudly and slowly clapped their hands, clearly watching what had just happened. The men came to their senses after the power of the word let them go, but they did not understand what had happened, and the one who was clapping behind praised the young man for how well he had said it. The owner of the Jiang family inn, Jiang Fugui, applauded the guy, and when he came closer, he added that he did not expect to meet such a talented young man, and at the same time regretted that Li was just an ordinary winemaker. Chang'an folded his hands to greet the master and bowed, introducing himself and saying that he would like to take part in the county examination next year. Jiang was amused by the guy's ambition, and he asked his employee who ordered the wine to give him the money, and clarified that since the employee had already ordered the drink from Li, they were obliged to pay regardless of the quality. Gu couldn't hold his tongue and told the gentleman that his worker was too kind and couldn't refuse the guy, even though everyone knew that the Li family's wine was disgusting, and offered 60 jins of his wine. Chang'an rightly responded to Gu's words that one can only know what kind of wine it really is by tasting the drink. The boy asked Mr. Jiang to compare Wanner's wine with the Li family's, and if Li's drink was better, then Gu would no longer tarnish the honor of his family with words. Gu was delighted with this move, being sure that it would be to his advantage, since it was impossible to learn how to make wine overnight, and he put forward his condition that if the drink was lousy, the guy and his family would no longer sell wine. Both winemakers agreed to the conditions put forward, as each of them had their own arguments on this matter. Gu and Chang'an poured their wine into sample bowls for Mr. Zhang, who still had his worker next to him. The winemakers handed bowls of drinks to Zhang, who smiled and promised to make a fair decision for both of them. The first drink Mr. Zhang tasted belonged to Gu, and the man slowly drained the cup. Zhang said that the drink does not contain any foreign impurities, but after drinking it there is a slight stickiness in the mouth, and indicated that this quality is above average. After Gu's drink, the innkeeper took the Li family's bowl of drink and also slowly drank it down to the bottom. Mr. Zhang's eyes widened in shock and confusion as to how the wine could possibly be of such high quality. The gentleman was struck by the purity and softness of the drink's taste and how it refreshed, spreading throughout the body like a balm. Zhang was overwhelmed with pleasant sensations, and he felt as if he was young again, and it seemed as if he was carefree, running along the seashore, enjoying the moment. There was no longer any drink in the bowl, but the innkeeper was ready to dry it so much that not even a drop remained. Zhang not only showed how much he liked the drink, but also immediately approved of the quality of the Li family's wine by directly speaking to Chang'an. Gu was outraged by the fact that it was impossible to make such wine overnight, and also because he essentially lost the deal. Zhang gave a semblance of a document to Chang'an, informing him that from now on, wine would only be supplied to his hotel from the Li family, and asked whether it would be possible to brew 60 gins a day. The guy convinced the gentleman that he could not worry about the timeliness of the drink's production, and he himself thought that his plan worked even better than expected. And in addition to the fact that he managed to rein in Gu, he also established a long-term cooperation. The neighbor stood by his cart, angry from defeat in this fight, unlike the guy who was able to teach the impudent guy a lesson without much effort. Chang'an went out with a basket on his shoulders to the fruit garden, which was in the suburbs, in search of the products he needed. And in the garden there were people who were picking fruits, and there were those who were selling them. The guy approached one of the sellers and asked why, among all the variety of fruits, he didn't have any hawthorn berries. The seller was surprised by the guy's interest in sour and tart berries, because of which no one would buy them even for a couple of coins, 1 jin, but he showed that there were a couple of berry bushes here that he was ready to give away for free. Li realized that in the world where he found himself, no one had ever tried hawthorn and sugar caramel, and this gave him the idea of making some extra money on the berries during a break from winemaking. The young man was distracted from his thoughts by the seller, who repeated whether the buyer still needed hawthorn, to which Li answered in the affirmative. Chang'an happily announced that he needed all the hawthorn that was in the fruit garden, which again surprised the seller. That same day at the Li family's home, the younger brother was teaching his sister how to prepare berries, explaining that they needed to remove the seeds and stick the berries on a stick, then cover them with hot caramel sugar. Sprinkling sugar on top of the berries, Chang'an explained that he had read the cooking method from an old book and added that if sales were good, they would be able to earn at least 100 taels of silver in just 5 days. Lu was surprised by this new product and did not yet understand why these berries were so good, so Li said that until she tried them she would not know, and gave her the treat. When the girl bit the first berry, a pleasant crunch of caramel was heard, and Liu continued to try the taste of the new sweetness for her. Liu was surprised that, despite the crunch of the caramel at the beginning, it then melted in her mouth, and to all this was added the sourness of the berries, which neutralized the sweetness of the caramel, resulting in an excellent taste. The sister, having thoroughly tasted the new product, agreed with Li's words that this sweet was really very tasty. Liu wanted to eat another berry, but her hair began to fall down towards the sticky dessert, and Chang'an hurried to fix the strand of hair, saying that he was very glad that his sister liked his idea. Because Li was quite close to the girl and there was an awkward pause, the girl's cheeks turned red. The librarian remembered again that he was a relative for the girl in this world, and having restored the distance between them, asked his sister to start selling sweets today, and Leo agreed. That same evening, Lu and two other sisters stood at the market wall and sold sweets, attracting customers with the new product. And people were really interested and came up to take the new sweets, and not just one piece, but several at once, which is why, in some places, some even got indignant, declaring that they also wanted to buy some. Jiyin calmed the crowd of angry customers by announcing that there would be enough sweets for everyone, after which everyone was satisfied. Very little time passed before all the sweets were sold out, and the stand for them in the girl's hand stood empty. The elder sister turned to the younger Lan and Fan, thanking them for their work and giving them their pay for today, and also called the sisters to continue tomorrow, hoping to sell even more. The younger sisters were outraged by the naivety of the elder Jiyin, who told her that they had no intention of coming tomorrow, since they could do the same thing and earn money on their own. The girl was shocked by such a statement from her sisters and asked them to think better of it and not to do this to her, because she was ready to help them. That's why she called and paid honestly. As always, Chang'an was nearby and, thanking the girls for their work today, asked them to leave since they had received their payment. Lu started crying and immediately began to blame herself for everything because she thought that she had let her brother down. But Li calmed the girl down, explaining that the sisters' actions were quite obvious because the sweet was not difficult to prepare. Zhiyin wiped away her tears and showed with her whole appearance that she did not fully understand what her brother wanted to say about the obviousness of what had happened. And Li explained that he knew about the appearance of those who would steal their idea and asked his sister what the most important thing is in preparing the sweet. Lu recalled that the two main ingredients for the sweet are hawthorn berries and sugar, which only needs to be melted. And after Zhiyin's answer, the guy explained as a conclusion that the sale of sugar is controlled by the authorities, while the sale of hawthorn is not under this control. Chang'an has already imagined a situation where people, after eating the new sweet, went to the fruit garden to buy hawthorn and also sell the new product. But the seller pointed his finger somewhere further and said that he didn't have any berries because all the bushes were bought by that guy. And Li would be the guy who bought up all the hawthorn and sold one jin for 15 coins, which would be unprofitable since one jin of berries could bring in 7 or 8 coins from sweets. Zhiyin was delighted and asked if her brother had known from the start that this would happen, to which Li replied that although the sweets were selling well, it was time-consuming, and it was easier to sell all the hawthorn at once. After explaining his cunning plan, Chang'an promised his sister that soon they would have only silver in their hands. One evening, Sister Liu decided to bring Brother Li to the Palace of Stars, which was located at the East Gate, where the County Poetry Festival was supposed to be held. At the entrance to the palace, in front of the crowd, stood the elder Gu Weidao, who was in charge of education issues in the county, and next to him were small assistants holding large scrolls. Jiying and Chang'an tried to get through the crowd, which was quite difficult, and they only angered the people who wanted to watch the tournament. Li tried to explain to his sister that they didn't have to go to the palace because he wasn't particularly interested in the festival right now, and was more focused on saving Linglong, and then he would prepare for the exam. But Jiying objected that Li was a very talented young man, and he definitely needed to try to take part so that everyone knew about his talent. When the girl finished her words, someone pushed her quite hard with an elbow, causing Lu to stagger towards her brother. Li, of course, caught Zhiyin by asking if everything was okay with her, and she replied that everything was fine with her, but it was unpleasant to receive this kick. Chang'an turned to the one who probably pushed his sister and sternly asked who this stranger was and why he did this to a person he didn't know. It was obvious that the scoundrel was from a rich family by his fancy clothes and the two guys accompanying him, and he emphasized that he didn't like it when poor people, having learned a couple of hieroglyphs, try to get ahead in life. The guy standing behind him recognized the guy as Li Chang'an and began to mock him, calling him a worthless person, which was picked up by the crowd standing behind Li himself and also began to mock, which made Liu feel uneasy. The girl asked for forgiveness for bringing her brother here and now he has to endure this. But Chang'an, as always, calmed Liu down, saying that she was not guilty of anything and understood that she wanted the best. Li decided to immediately show what he was made of and turned to the upstart, asking whether he had heard the expression, "Don't judge war heroes and educated people by their origins." Chang'an also added that people like them, who come from humble families, can be more well-read than kids like this arrogant guy who has had a silver spoon in his mouth since childhood, and the crowd began to buzz. Elder Gu noticed the altercation and concluded that the skinny guy in simple clothes had a sense of self-worth. Both sides argued about who was poor and who was rich, and that the quantity and quality of knowledge actually did not depend on this, and the crowd simply watched the spectacle. Elder Gu wanted to use the potential of both sides to good use, so he stopped the arguments that were leading nowhere. Not only the opponents, but also the entire crowd fell silent, and then the gentleman said that given the impasse of this discussion, it was worth resorting to resolving this issue in another way. The upstart immediately agreed with the elder, expressing his desire to demonstrate his abilities and talent. Chang'an folded his hands in front of the master, and sternly but respectfully also stated that he wanted to take part in the duel. Master Gu held up one of the scrolls and explained that the lines written on them were prepared to test those wishing to participate in the festival, and that it was thanks to them that the dispute that had arisen could be resolved. The elder raised his hand and unrolled all 5 scrolls and explained that the winner would be the one who completed the most quatrains within 12 moves, and in addition, the winner would be able to take part in the festival. Elder Gu announced to the participants that they could begin, and next to the master, there were again 2 assistants who had the necessary writing tools in their hands. Li looked at the lines thoughtfully and accepted the fact that this was not an easy task, while the arrogant one also looked at the poetry, but showed that he was worried. People in the crowd began to whisper that the poems needed to be completed with the appropriate number of characters and that they needed to stick to the same syntax. And although everyone laughed at first, now everyone was hoping for Li to win. The librarian had an ace up his sleeve in the form of a system that contained the books of the National Library, so the task would have been really difficult, but not this time. Chang'an moved decisively towards the elder's assistants in order to use the necessary tool. Li took a huge brush, which had already been dipped in ink at the tip, and all that was left was to start writing. And so the first quatrain came together, causing the cravel of a poem for a book, and if his next creation was bad, he would be dismissed as a mediocrity. Chang'an thanked the masters for caring for him, but bowed with the text in his hands and still insisted that he wanted to try his hand. The guy thought to himself that if he had been dissuaded a couple of days ago, he would have backed down, but now his comrades had stopped working at the kiosks and were busy with the gang, so he had to get this money so that his friends wouldn't go hungry because of him. The master was amused by the young man's eagerness to find out what he was capable of and that he wanted to be the first in everything, but Li replied that this was not entirely true and that he was more driven by confidence in his work. Qin was amazed at how respectful the student was towards himself, and with the same attitude he asked to read his work. So he agreed to take a look, and Shu began to read the poem with him. Having read the title alone, the master and deputy were horrified by how reverently and tenderly it already spoke of the love that was described in the book. Shu found in the poem the hatred of a woman who was abandoned, comparable to the bitterness of nuts and faded silk, while Qin saw, on the contrary, the love and longing of a woman for her beloved who left home for a long time. The deputy felt what women feel when they love and saw it in the lines that were quite straightforward at the beginning, but gradually became sophisticated at the end. Qin praised the work as poignant and heartbreaking, but still a beautiful read. The deputy and the master were so carried away by the work that they already imagined the scene between the man and the woman and even began to apply their roles to themselves by acting out the scene. The guy was a little confused by what he saw in front of him, so he carefully asked the mentors if everything was okay with them. The men were overcome by Li's intoxicating performance of scenes from the book and the poem, and they looked at each other in horror. The mentors instantly moved away from each other and were ready to sink into the ground from shame, and Qin, in order to distract the students' attention, said that he would immediately hand over the verse to the Kunwen Bureau. Chang'an was very happy that he managed not only to write a poem, but also to make an impression on the masters with its help, and he bowed in gratitude. The student left the office and walked further down the corridor on his business, while in the room there was an important conversation between the masters. Qin admitted out loud that Tai Bai's new creation, although not up to par with Ascension to the Tower, was still a masterpiece, and the master wondered what the boy would be able to show them in the future. Shu also admitted that the poem was perfect for eating words, but at the same time he cautiously asked the master if the student was too skilled for his age, since this would be dangerous. Kinya was amused by how Shu was worried about the young man, but he said that he was not afraid for himself, so they did not need to. But at the same time, the master agreed with the deputy that he was right and the guy really was a genius, which they would not be able to hide for a long time. At the Kongwan Bureau of Ding'an County, the debate over the poem was in full swing, and cries of admiration and indignation could be heard every now and then. Everyone crowded around Master Huan, who wrote eating words, not understanding whether he liked the poem or not, and some still didn't even know who wrote the creation. Huang Qingshan jumped to his feet and burst into tears because his book was not worthy of the poem that Li Taibai wrote, so he would take on the task of rewriting the book. One of the assistants tried to persuade Huan not to do this, since the printing of the book would begin in 5 days, but the master shouted that he was obliged to rewrite the book, so he would do it at a pace he had never done before and strictly forbade anyone to distract him. The assistant got angry because he didn't understand why the poems of some Taibai were so good and began to stomp his foot on the floor menacingly. Poems for the book continued to arrive at the Kunwen Bureau, but the author Huang, although he thanked the writers, refused their works, explaining that there was already a suitable poem. Huan directly declared to everyone that the works that were brought to him could no longer be better than the new song of the poplar and willow branches. Masters Zhao from Zongyue Academy and Liu from Xiangshan Academy were shocked that the author of the book made his conclusion without even reading their works, and asked who had impressed Huang so much. Huang smiled mysteriously and said the name of the student of the Bailu Academy, who was already known as a genius, and it was Li Taibai. The masters of the academies were horrified by what they heard, because only recently no one knew about this man, but now he is famous. The poets heard of the sudden fame of a simpleton and were pressured both by the fact that he was strong in the literary Tao and by the fact that he would outshine them with his works. The hearts and minds of the masters were filled with envy, followed by anger, from the fact that if this damn genius continued to become more and more famous, there would be no room left for them. So it was decided to unite and rein in the upstart. Li sat at the table in the academy holding the promised reward in his hands, surprised that they had sent it so quickly. But Annan put the guy down on the ground, asking if he really didn't notice anything at all. Annan grabbed Chang'an's face sharply but carefully and asked him to look carefully in the direction he was turning it. Li was first taken aback by the fact that his friend grabbed his face so abruptly, and then by what he saw when his face turned. The other students looked at Chang'an with such fierce hatred that if they could, they would incinerate him with just one look, and Annan explained that the guy had wiped their noses twice in a very short time. Li turned back and asked warily if Brother Annan also hated him now for his success at the academy. Annan couldn't help but joke about his friend, so he paused to deliberately make him nervous and simply stared at him with his back to Zhang. But he clearly heard that the moment when people would stop being afraid to walk the streets or trade would soon become real. The warriors returned, praising their master for being smart and for his plan working perfectly, although they had to rough up Old Man Tian and his men a bit so as not to arouse suspicion, but they were able to kill 47 of Long Hu's thugs. Li thanked the warriors for the work they had done, and after that the men, pointing to the 3 prisoners, said that as a gift they had found those 3 scumbags who had stolen the Liu sisters. Chang'an approached the elder Shi, whose hand he had once hit with a bowl, to let go of the girl in the restaurant. Chang'an did not take his eyes off the scoundrel and asked him to give him the crossbow that the archers had already shot from today. Shay turned whiter than chalk when a crossbow with a loaded arrow that looked sharper than a blade was brought to his face, but he couldn't utter a word because his mouth was closed. Li continued to hold the crossbow and looked closely at the bandit and then asked if he remembered him. When the gag was pulled out of Shah's mouth, even under threat of death, he snapped that he shouldn't remember anyone he met and reminded everyone who he was and what gang he was from and that it would be better for them to let him go. Chang'an's eyes turned red with anger, and he mentioned that he was no longer a simple stranger to Shi since this freak stole his sisters, after which he brazenly lies that he doesn't remember this. Being both a librarian and Li Chang'an, this man's hand trembled as he placed his finger on the trigger of the crossbow, apparently having never killed a person before. One of the warriors noticed the guy's excitement and indecision and offered to do it instead of him, but then Jiang put his hand on his comrade's shoulder. When the fellow soldier turned to Zhang, he said not to interfere, but on the warrior's face there was a silent question why he couldn't do it instead of the guy. To which Jiang asked a very reasonable question. Would a soldier follow a man who was unable to finish off his enemies? Both his comrades looked at the young man, and Zhang explained that Chang'an needed to finish the job himself in order to show his brothers that he was worthy of their loyalty. But the former soldier noted that Li was too young for that. Chang'an finally told Shi that he was not a saint and never thought that he would have to kill. But the case with the thugs was different, and he should not have gotten involved with his family. Li shot an arrow into Shay's head, saying that he would still have to die after everything he had done, including kidnapping his sisters. Shi, bleeding profusely, fell forward, face down, dead, in front of Chang'an's feet, but he didn't even flinch or lower his crossbow. The guy looked at the remaining two freaks who were shaking and mumbling something, but it was impossible to make out, and pointed out to them that all the lives of the Long Hu gang members were not worth a hair on the heads of his sisters. 2 more arrows were fired from the crossbow into the heads of the bandits, and they hit, staining the floor of the courtyard where Jiang's comrades were gathering with their blood. The former warrior and Jiang stood there dumbfounded and couldn't even find anything to say about the confidence of this young man who was able to go all the way. Zhang looked at the man who not only had not been broken by the difficulties facing him, but had made him even stronger in their eyes. Li Chang'an became the warrior's equivalent of the Dark Lord, who was cruel but fair and willing to take risks to save others. The guy found himself in the darkness and heard someone's hands scratching the damp earth and voices howling, asking why he had committed this murder and dealt with violence with exactly the same violence. 3 bandits rose from the ground in front of Li, and he shot arrows into their heads, and she, barely moving from foot to foot, warned the young man that since he had taken the path of a murderer, the same fate awaited him. Even while in such a bad vision, the guy shouted that he was Li Chang'an, and that he was his path, and that he was the master of his destiny, and kicked Shi in the face. 2 mutilated bodies also approached Chang'an, and in terrible, hoarse, blood-soaked voices shouted at him that he was a murderer. The guy's eyes lit up with fire, and he asked the evil spirits if they really wanted to die a second time. With streams of fire, Li incinerated 2 of the dead at the same time, and there was no trace left of them, but there was another problem waiting for him. She held Zhi Yin by the throat and smiled evilly, telling the youth that no matter how strong he became, he still wouldn't be able to protect his family. And if he was distracted for a moment, his sisters would end up in his clutches again. Chang'an was overcome with anger and shouted at the bastard to let the girl go right now, otherwise he would follow his friends. But she, making a terrible grimace, began to tear off Zhi Yin's head, laughing that the sisters were facing a tragic future precisely because of Li, and the girl screamed her brother's name, experiencing terrible pain. Li rushed towards his sister, stretching out his hand in order to save her, but it was too late, and he seemed to be moving away from her. A heart-rending scream came from the room where Chang'an was sleeping, to which Zhi Yin woke up and immediately went to the guy. Li was sitting in bed, covered in a cold sweat and trying to catch his breath when the doors opened, and Zhi Yin came in, asking if everything was okay. The young man, all pale and wet, turned to the girl, so happy to see her in front of him that it even looked creepy. Chang'an rushed to hug Zhi Yin, comforting himself that it was just a dream, and his sister was okay, which made her very surprised. Li looked at his sister while she told him that she was indeed fine. But the boy, still under the influence of the nightmare, began to stutter and explain that Zhi Yin and Linglong were in danger because of him. Lu was embarrassed and assured her brother that it was not his fault that what happened, because she and Linglong were trapped precisely because of those scoundrels. The girl reminded Li that it was he who revealed so many interesting things to her, and thanks to him she got to the Palace of Stars and helped rescue her sister, so the way he cared will forever remain in her heart. Zhi Yin admitted that if the time came when she had to die for Chang'an, she would do it without hesitation. Li found it difficult to restrain himself, and he touched the girl's face and was so close that it took his breath away. Zhi Yin was afraid of what might happen, especially when Chang'an began to say that she was the only one who gave him peace and comfort. The girl jumped up from the bed and, putting some distance between them, put her hands in front of her while shouting that they couldn't be together. Liu took the lamp and headed towards the exit. After wishing Chang'an a final good night, she also went off to get some sleep. The guy looked at Zhi Yin and how the doors closed behind her just as they were closed in her heart. Chang'an sat holding his chest, where his heart was beating wildly, wanting to jump out at any moment, and he realized that he wanted to protect the girl, but instead he almost hurt her himself. Trying to calm himself down and convince himself that Zhiyin couldn't like him didn't lead to anything, so he wanted to let his feelings out and took out a piece of paper. Armed with a brush, the young man began to write out the words of Shanxi's poem entitled, "O Heaven." The brush seemed to connect with the heart, and the words fell onto the paper easily and enthusiastically, like the feelings the boy experienced. Chang'an felt much lighter in his heart when he wrote out the text of the work on paper, thus showing his love. In the tower of the academy, the student met with the master and deputy, who were perplexed as to how the boy could write a work better than the new song of the poplar and willow branches. But when Li again confirmed that the poem was indeed better, Shu was furious about why the young man did not want to publish the creation on March 6th. The master and his deputy reminded the student of the importance of submitting his work to the sage's March list on time, and not 6 days later as he wanted, because then he risks being left unmarked. Li explained that he wanted to publish the poem on March 6th, on the occasion of the birthday of the person to whom it was dedicated, so that she would see it first. The men pounced on the guy, shouting at him that he was an idiot for wasting such an opportunity on love instead of his reputation. Shu and Qin asked again if the student was ready to take such a risk, even if it meant that he would not be noticed and others would be included on the list, to which Li completely agreed. The student knelt down and bowed respectfully, explaining that the girl was more important to him than reaching the top, and hoped for the master's understanding and permission to take such a risk. Qin nevertheless made an attempt to persuade the young man, citing the argument that with his talent he would easily reach the top, and thanks to this, in the future he would be able to take the best girl in the empire as his wife. But Li stood firm on his own, regardless of who this girl might be, and even the emperor's daughter did not interest him. For the guy, none of the listed options could compare with the one to whom he dedicated his poem and his feelings. Chang'an introduced her and explained that the girl had settled in his heart, and he had the warmest and most tender feelings for her. Shu asked rather sternly and suspiciously who this person was, since the letter from Teacher Gu did not mention Li's beloved, but only spoke about his sisters. The deputy was furious that he had guessed about Chang'an's feelings for the daughter-in-law of his elder brother Li, who had long since gone off to war. Shu asked the guy if his guesses were correct about his beloved, and Chang'an bowed and honestly answered that she really was his sister and he was unable to hide it. Both mentors cried out that such a thing was a contradiction to the canons and rules because such a relationship contradicted the teachings left to them as the first saint, and if someone found out, the student could be killed. Li hastened to clarify to the masters that he and his sister had not violated a single rule of the first saint's teaching. Chang'an mentioned that Zhiyin and his older brother never had a wedding ceremony because his brother and father went off to war just before the wedding. The student also added that given what happened, formally his older brother and Lu Zhiyin are not even married to each other. Li was filled with warm feelings for the girl for another reason. Even after his brother left, Zhiyin did not leave the poor guy alone and looked after him during his illness and sometimes even brought him back from the other world. Chang'an was filled with gratitude and respect for this girl because she did not give up on him even knowing that he might not recover, which he would never forget, and could not give up his feelings for her. Master Qin approached the guy and, putting his hand on his shoulder, approved his decision, considering that it did not go against the teachings, and said that the academy would support him, so the student could act as he saw fit. And so the race began for places on the March Sage list, which for the first time did not include a new work by Li Taibai, as he waited until the 6th. But despite the start of the competition, sales of the book Eating Words, which included Chang'an's poem, also started on March 1st, and people mostly bought them only because they contained Li's creation. Thanks to the sales of the book, the new song of the poplar and willow branches took 20th place in the sages list, and people bought up the books in places not one, but 2 or more copies. As befits envious people, seeing that Li Taibai's poem was rising in the list thanks to book sales, they gave orders to their assistants to tell the major stores to act according to plan. On March 2nd, booksellers attracted male audiences with books about battles and the strength of warriors, emphasizing that this was better than sappy love stories, and additionally offered a promotion for buying the first book, get the second one for free. Men, of course, took the bait of such a proposal, so as not to tarnish their reputation with love stories, and switched to literature that suited them. From the shop where the book Eating Words was sold, buyers rushed to where the offer was more tempting, and accordingly, the master's plan to reduce sales worked. The list began to change rapidly, and instead of Li's verse rising, it was actually falling due to the loss of customers. In this way, the masters managed to ensure that the upstart Taibai and his work dropped from 20th place to 70th. On March 3rd, someone approached a shop with books about love and, furiously throwing coins at the books, declared that he would buy this book since the others refused. The novel has now attracted the female part of the population who were deeply touched by the lines of the work, and they decided to support eating words at all costs. One of the men responded sarcastically to the girl's admiration, pointing out that only they would like such a poem about tragic love, to which the girl confidently replied that men speak so of Tai Bai's work because they themselves would not write such a thing. From that moment on, there were fierce disputes between men and women about which literature was suitable for whom, as well as about the work of Li's disciple. The list began to change again at a furious rate, only now Li's verse skyrocketed incredibly quickly. The jump was simply lightning fast, and now the creation of the Academy student was in third place, which indicated an increase in sales. The masters were furious because the attempt to bring down Taipei was unsuccessful in every sense, because the young man's popularity actually grew. One of the mentors sternly declared that from now on there would be no mercy. Therefore, every effort would be made to destroy this simpleton so that no one would even remember him. Some students sat and heatedly discussed that the sage's list seemed to have gone crazy because that song was jumping up and down sharply, while others noted for themselves that Teak was now in third place, which again speaks of Tai Bai's talent. Anand decided to ask his friend if he had written the last lines of the song, thinking about his beloved, to which Li replied in the negative. Friend An breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that perhaps he had just worked himself up about it. But when Chang'an said that he had written another poem for his beloved and would publish it in a couple of days on the occasion of her birthday, An felt his temper boil. An was about to start yelling at Li, accusing him of something, but he didn't have time because Guan flew up to his friends with some news. It was obvious that Guan was in a hurry because he was out of breath, and he told Li that things were bad, because his verse was about to fly out of the top 100 of the list of saints. Chang'an was surprised at how this could happen, since even if you don't count the third place of the verse, it was at least in 70th place. Guan went into more detail about how the masters from the Songyue Academy had united to deliberately ruin the Song of Tai Bai, which is why the rating was melting before their eyes, and showed the guys the talisman. As a fifth-stage master, Lu poured mud on Li's creation, claiming that the author was too blinded by the theme of love, which is why he had a narrow view of the world and called on others to stray from the path of Tao if they considered a student a genius. At the time of the master's appearance, Song Li occupied the 78th place on the list, but the teachers wanted to completely push the creation out of there, considering both the verse and the author unworthy of being there. Surprisingly, instead of Chang'an, it was An who flared up first, angry at how the masters were humiliating his friend, and without delay, he immediately went to deal with the mentors. Li asked his comrade not to get excited, but An said that for such words as the masters said, one must answer, and it doesn't matter what rank of mentor you are, after which he moved to the list with the help of a talisman, and appeared in the space where the teachers were and immediately addressed them, calling on them to stop sowing discord among the students. Anand directly told the masters that their intention to sow discord was based on the fact that even they recognized Li's poems as real art, and therefore acted out of envy. One of the teachers was still trying to control himself and calmly replied that they were opening everyone's eyes, on the contrary, in the hope that Li would realize his mistake and take the true path of Tao, but there was no intent here. Anya was infuriated by how they were now trying to make a fool out of him, hiding behind the false truths of the path of the literary Tao, and he put his power into play. The master was of course stronger than the student and simply stepped aside, redirecting Anand's power. But now, when the young man dared to raise his hand against his elders and those of higher rank, the mentor also activated his power. The teacher's ki was many times more powerful than the student's, so no matter how An set up defense, the blow was mortally dangerous, at least for the body. Since the guy's defense was weaker than the chi master's, he began to cough up blood when he returned to his comrades. Li caught his friend and, holding his wounded body, heard from Anya that he was very sorry for how everything turned out, and that he could not protect his friend and his creation. Inside Chang'an, many feelings merged into one, including gratitude to his brother, anger at the masters, and worry that everything would be okay with An. Now it was Li's turn to go up to the list and meet face to face with those who had decided to decide his fate for him, which was a bitter pill to swallow for the young man. The masters apparently sought a personal meeting with the student, since they were still waiting by the list. The treasure the guy had found in the form of fire energy was activated immediately, and he, feeling pure, furious anger, said that since the masters so persistently wanted to help him get on the true path, he would accept their help. After speaking, Lee released a huge stream of fire towards the mentors that would have incinerated an ordinary person instantly. But the Chi Chang'an masters were under such extreme pressure that they were unable to move, let alone put up a defense. The mentor who stood in front of the other two was outraged that this brat did not respect masters like them. The students were constantly watching with the help of talismans what was happening at the list, and were glad that Tai Bai was able to rebuff the teachers who, with their actions, disgrace all the masters of the path of literary Tao. Li was wise beyond his years, and instead of wasting his energy on the envy of the masters, he suggested that they stop squabbling and wait for the results of the sage's list, because in that case everything would be decided fairly for both sides. The mentors called on Lu to accept the boys' offer, because if they don't stop now and most likely lose, they will never wash away this shame. Chang'an had no intention of provoking anyone, but looking at Lu, he asked point blank, was the master really so afraid that his poem would lose and the song would win? The mentor didn't even make an effort to control himself even a little bit, which is why he was now furious again from the truth that was told. But the pressure from the chi that Li sent into the masters was strong, which is why the master, in another fit of anger, only made things worse for himself and coughed up blood. Chang'an turned around and before leaving said that the feelings he put into the work were sincere and pure, thanks to which the lines of the creation would reach the hearts of readers. And in addition, unlike his mentors, he was confident in his work. Li returned back, and he was already surrounded by students who were watching everything, discussing the fact that there had not yet been anyone who could immediately provoke the teachers, and now rumors would spread about this phenomenon. That cherished 6th of March has arrived, and the weather itself congratulated the birthday girl on her holiday, giving her warming rays of the sun. Chang'an presented Zhiyin with a gift in the form of a beautiful bracelet made from the stone that was in the box. The girl was pleasantly surprised that Li remembered her birthday and immediately began to worry that the gift was too expensive. The guy reverently took Liu by the hand and put on the bracelet, saying that she didn't need to worry at all about the price of the gift. While Zhiyin was examining the jewelry, Chang'an explained that the bracelet was engraved with a poem that was dedicated specifically to her and was the main gift. And when the girl said that it was a little difficult to see the hieroglyphs, Li put his arm around her shoulders and offered to read it. Chang'an recited lines in which he called to heaven the desire to find his beloved, thereby showing the scale of his feelings, and for a moment both imagined themselves in the place described in the verse. Li finished his poem and gently touched the girl's face, never taking his eyes off her for a second, and the feeling was mutual. The guy finally decided to take this step and timidly confessed to Zhiyin that he loved her and had loved her all the time. Liu always suppressed the same feelings in herself, so as not to disgrace her honor, and her husband, who went to war, now stood with tears in her eyes and also confessed her love to Chang'an. Now that both were not afraid of either condemnation or slander, they finally kissed, giving free rein to their feelings for each other. But the moment of rapprochement between the lovers did not last long, and when the doors to the room opened, something fragile fell to the floor and shattered into pieces. Linlong stood at the threshold, pale and unable to say anything other than asking what was going on here. Poor Linlong was upset and angry at the same time, not believing that they had actually confessed their love to each other, despite the fact that they both knew how long she had liked Li. The little girl screamed in her heart that she didn't care about their feelings for each other, so if Li kissed Zhiyin, he should kiss her too. Chang'an didn't expect that everything would turn out like this, and now he was in a stupor, because he didn't know at all how to act in such a situation. Linlong flew up to the guy and hugged him, kissing him on the cheek, which made Li extremely uncomfortable, and he cursed like a statue. The little girl looked at Chang'an and offendedly called everything that happened unfair, and added that although she was ready to accept the fact that the guy loved her older sister more, she also wanted to be on the list, at least in second place. When Li agreed with the younger one and she left, Zhiyin thanked the young man for how he made her birthday the best ever. Chang'an was able to make the girl look surprised when he said that the day was not over yet, and he had another surprise prepared for her. In order to create the atmosphere that Li had in mind, it was necessary to wait until evening, and when it got dark, he took Zhiyin outside, where many sky lanterns were flying in the air. Other residents also noticed the lanterns, stopping and watching their flight, and some wondered who this Zhiyin was who was so lucky, and some envied her that such a romantic guy was already taken. The couple admired how the lanterns with the words of the poem flew higher and higher, and Chang'an said that he wanted the whole world to know about his love for the girl. The day after Zhiyin's birthday at the academy, An had already managed to ask if the boy was yawning so much because he hadn't slept all night, to which Li replied that he hadn't slept because he was so nervous after publishing the poem. Chang'an looked at the talisman, disappointed by his own unjustified expectations that the poem would still appear on the list. But if the song was in 12th place, then heaven was not there. At that moment, Annan was analyzing that yesterday's paper lanterns were the work of Li, and his comrade wondered if he really loved the girl that much. While An was breathing down Chang'an's neck and was tormented by the question of who Liu Zhiyin was, the guy was sad at that moment because there was a risk that no one would find out about his new poem. Barely audibly, An voiced his thoughts that if the poem had not attracted anyone's attention, then it would be worth making the name of Li Tai itself popular. Chang'an turned around so abruptly, being incredibly happy with his friend's advice, that An seemed to swallow his tongue and only looked at his comrade with huge, frightened eyes. Li was happy like a child, thanking his friend for having him and for giving him such a wonderful idea, because now the guy even understood how to implement this idea, and An, timidly and embarrassedly, replied that he was glad to help. Chang'an heard his friend say something else and asked again what they were talking about because it seemed to him that his friend had said something important. But An, pretending not to say anything, shifted the focus of attention to asking what Li had already come up with for himself regarding the promotion of his name. Chang'an had a brilliant plan to raise his reputation, thanks to those he could also help, and that was the Kunwen Bureau. The seller standing behind the bookstall loudly announced that the book Eating Words included a handwritten version of the poem New Song of the Poplar and Willow Branches written by Li Tai himself. The girls immediately came running to buy the book they loved, and now they also had the opportunity to receive a poem from the hand of Li Tai himself, which gave them the feeling that he had personally written the love story. The masters watched from the window the crowd of girls at the yatka with books, and were indignant that now this Li really wants to rise higher in the list thanks to his calligraphy, because this is a trick that only such women fall for. The girl couldn't stop looking at the piece of paper with Tai-bai's handwriting, the calligraphy of which was mesmerizing. The student who had been standing next to the master and was indignant carefully looked at the sheet of paper that the girl was holding and was impressed by the calligraphy of Li's writing. The guy snatched the sheet from the girl's hands and began to examine Tai-bai's Xing Shu, praising it and comparing it to clouds floating in the sky, and admitted that he had never seen such skill. The young man holding a bag of money asked the young lady if she would mind selling him this piece of paper, to which the girl responded categorically, saying that you can't buy something like that for 1,000 gold pieces, and commanded him to go and buy it himself. The guy ran to the stall with books, shouting that he also wanted to make it in time and buy himself at least one copy of this masterpiece manuscript. The masters, who also decided to look at the hieroglyphs written by Tai-bai, were taken aback when they saw that it turned out that the guy was good not only in poetry, but also in calligraphy. For a moment, the mentors felt uneasy at the thought that this disciple could really be the reincarnation of the first saint. Chang'an heard the list begin to move and picked up his talisman, realizing that this time he would see a different picture. And indeed, the last verse about heaven dedicated to his beloved appeared in the sage's list in 99th place. Li moved to his palace of literature and stood by the monument, realizing that one of them was for emergencies, but it was thanks to him that his art of calligraphy would become similar to that of Wang Shiji, the famous Chinese calligrapher. Taking the brush in his hands, the guy began to absorb the knowledge that Van had at one time and began to draw hieroglyphs, being confident that such skill would not leave anyone indifferent. The rating of the poem O Heaven, dedicated to Liu Zhiyin, grew at a rapid speed and now only went up the list, and many people watched this with a variety of feelings. Guan's study buddy, and the one who helped everyone learn the Song of Tai-bai, was filled with pride for his friend, and that he was able to show the love between a man and a woman perfectly. But Huanru was deeply upset by the fact that the poem O Heaven was dedicated to a certain Zhiyin, and it was difficult for her to accept that the young man's heart was already taken. Well, Master Luya was irritated by the fact that the success and fame of this young scoundrel could not be stopped in any way, and the old man was tormented by the question of how and where such a young guy was able to master such a skill. Shu, looking at the talisman, once again remembered with gratitude Elder Gu, who sent them the genius Li, thanks to whom the Bailu Academy also gained popularity. The moment of jubilation was interrupted by a knock on the door, where Tai appeared, asking if the deputy could spare him a little time. The smile that was on the man's face while he was alone suddenly disappeared, and he got angry at the guy for wanting to take a vacation again. But Lee replied that he had absolutely nothing to do with it this time. Chang'an smiled and showed the letter from the elder as proof, saying that Master Gu had asked him to return home urgently to take the county examination. The escort showed the students where to go, reminding them that their exam would soon begin. Elder Gu explained to the boy with all seriousness that if he could pass the exam, his name would be entered into the temple book of the list of followers of the path of the literary Tao, and thanks to this, he and his family would be protected. Chang'an, as always, bowed to his mentor and thanked him, saying that he understood everything, to which the master asked him to be attentive to the questions and answers. Lee was the last one to enter the gate where the escort showed him and followed the rest of the students. Standing in neat rows, the students bowed to the holy altar at the command of the two masters, according to traditional custom for the examination to begin. As soon as the students bowed, bright tongues of energy resembling flames began to erupt from the huge cauldron. These energy flows presented each student with completely different tasks written on paper, which Lee considered an absolutely fair approach. After receiving their assignments, the students went their separate ways one by one, and each took a separate place separated from each other. Chang'an reread the questions and assessed them as not difficult, and from this the conclusion emerged that he should not have any difficulties with the answers. One of the masters standing at the altar lit a special candle and announced that while it burned, the students could answer questions, and the candle burned for approximately 10 hours. The sun didn't care whether someone had an important day or not. It did its job by giving light and warmth. But the students had no time to look up and be distracted by the good weather, since the importance of the exam was like a matter of life and death. Lee was the first to raise his hand and ask the masters if he could hand over the work already if he had finished it, and those who were sitting on both sides of him even looked out from behind their tables to see who had managed to finish it ahead of time. The other people taking the exam began to be outraged, again out of envy, shouting at the guy that only an hour had passed since the start, and he couldn't have passed so quickly, and if he didn't have enough knowledge, then he should just admit it. But the master standing at the altar did not react to the students' cries, and calmly told the young man that he could throw his answer sheet into the sacred cauldron. Chang'an walked up to the cauldron, the size of which was astonishing, and threw a rolled-up piece of paper inside. A glow appeared from the cauldron again, which this time looked more like a hot ball, and Lee watched carefully and waited to see what would happen next. On the round ball was written the result, namely that the exam was passed and the grade of Chang'an's answers was level A. What a disappointment the students were, but not in the young man, but in relation to their work, because not only did he complete it in an hour, but he also passed it with excellent marks, which is impossible, and some even started shouting that the boiler had made a mistake. One of the masters sternly declared that the chatter that was going on here should stop, because if the students did not want to take the exam in this way, then no one was holding them back, and the boiler could not have made a mistake. The master pointed to the door and told Chang'an that since he had passed the exam, he could go to the palace of the first saint and write his works there. Lee carefully and slowly opened the doors, looking into something like this for the first time, and thought that after the treasury, he would not see anything more special. But a completely different world opened up before him, and you wouldn't see anything like it even in a sky densely strewn with stars on the clearest night. Lee looked up where the monuments hung huge as a rock, and the guy asked himself out loud if this was really the palace of the first saint. Suddenly a monument appeared in front of the young man, but unlike the others, which were dark, this one glowed brighter than the sun in the sky. In the midst of this darkness, which was softly illuminated by the stars and constellations, such a sharp and bright light forced Lee to cover his face with his hands so as not to go blind. But before Chang'an could even get used to such bright lighting, he suddenly felt his heart brightly, and now he had even forgotten about the bright source. Lee understood that his feelings were connected with the fact that the power of the literary chi of the first saint was flowing into him, and in addition to his body, his palace of literature was being improved, but the energy was too powerful, which is why blood began to ooze from his mouth. The bright light and the guy's screams from the door attracted some dark creatures that were neither human nor beasts. These higher beings recognized the energy of the owner of the Xiantian body in the young man, and now they needed to take some measures because if they left him, there would be one more genius in the world that would prevent them from surviving. One of the figures did not hesitate, and releasing a bright stream of power from its finger, decided that the owner must die here and now. This ray of the creature hit directly into the heart of the vulnerable Chang'an at that moment, causing him to scream furiously in pain. Li fell to the floor, and everything around immediately became dark. Just like at the beginning, when he just entered here, and holding his chest, the guy tried to move away from what had just happened to him. The student dodged the shot in time, although he risked being killed immediately. But that power did not feel like the power of the first sage to him, but something else. While the young man was thinking about what this unknown attempt on his life was, another danger was already waiting, and Li, raising his head, saw a huge wave in front of him, but it was like hot lava. Chang'an looked up at how high this wave rose above him and understood that he would definitely not survive this. But the achievements of the literary Tao of the student worked as a defense mechanism when it seemed there was no chance of salvation. The scroll of Li's achievements began to rapidly swirl like a funnel, distorting what had been accumulated in it. When the wave almost covered the young man, taking his life with it, the scroll with the achievements of the literary Tao rolled up, hiding everything. As soon as the scroll hid the achievements, the dark entity directing the wave at the student realized that it did not feel any traces of achievements in the person. The entity waved its hand towards itself, calling the wave back, and decided for itself that this was just a waste of time. Chang'an stood there waiting for his death and continued to stand and watch the wave recede. But as before, he still did not understand what had happened. The guy realized that his jade scroll, which he received at the academy in time, hid all his achievements in literature, from which he concluded that the entity wanted to take not him but specifically Jiantian's body. Li only had to relax for a moment and exhale that everything was okay, when something rushed at him again, and this time it was related to the palace. Bright stripes of light bound the young man's body so that he could not move in any way, but this time he did not understand what was happening again. As it turned out, he was tied up by monuments, and a voice from space said that he, in the name of the first saint, was bestowing the palace of literary Tao on the disciple. But Chang'an's exclamations that he already had one did not help. The human body could not withstand such a filling of energy, and Li screamed from the tearing feeling inside. The two strong energies of the Jade Scroll and the new palace collided in the body. Because the scroll hid the disciple's achievements, the saint took him for an absolute beginner and therefore created another palace. The guy realized that there were currently two literary palaces inside him when he felt their collision inside. The collision caused the new palace to crack, causing injuries to the student's physical body, and Li began to cough up blood. Chang'an fell to his knees, bleeding and exhausted, and he was even more frightened by the fact that the emergence of a palace inside the master meant an attachment to life. And if something happened to the new palace, then it would also be the end for him. The desire to remain the master of his destiny always prevailed at the most necessary moments, and Li remembered his treasure that he had once chosen. The guy activated the spark technique that ignited the steps despite its tiny size but was powerful. Using his remaining strength and screaming furiously, Chang'an freed himself from the currents that were binding his entire body. The Jade Palace within the disciple gradually began to shrink, making room for a new palace, thereby reducing the risk of collision. After everything that happened, Li was shaking like an aspen leaf, but he was consoled by the fact that he was able to transfer part of the qi from the Jade Scroll to the new palace. But there was still one problem, which was that at the end of March the sages' list would be approved, and the accumulated qi for 2 verses would flow into the Jade Scroll, and Chang'an was afraid of not having time to transfer it to the new palace, which could cause it to collapse. The young man left the palace, telling himself that he couldn't just up and die, so he set himself the goal of nourishing his new palace with qi in the remaining half a month. Sometime after the exam, Chang'an decided to personally visit the Kongwen Bureau to inquire about what was wrong with his book. But the bureau employee nervously replied that everything was fine with the book. It was just that romance novels don't sell very well, and if you take into account eating words, it sold thanks to Li Taibai's poem, so now he has to refuse to print the book. Chang'an realized that he did not have time to spin the verse offering wine, so he would have to use the Chinese legend about the 2 lovers Liang and Zhu. Li took a different approach and asked if the bureau would be able to sell his books if he himself paid all the printing costs. But the employee was stubborn, claiming that there was no point in this. Chang'an bowed and respectfully replied that the risks the employee was talking about were of no importance to him, and that he was only asking to take over the sales bureau. The worker, although worried, nevertheless agreed with the young man and announced the rules of the academy, according to which the minimum order is 10,000 copies, and the cost of one book is 14 coins and the sale is 23. Lee told the employee his desire to sign a contract for 100,000 copies, mentioning that he would pay the costs himself. Here the uncle felt completely uneasy from the numbers he heard, and he began to dissuade the guy, naming the payment amount of 1,000 taels of silver, and even if the books could be sold, it would only be a loss of capital. The young man calmly mentioned that such a problem did not bother him, and the worker, having resigned himself to the client's decision, asked to follow him. Other workers, hearing the whole situation, began to mock Lee behind his back, saying that he was another fool who thought he could buy fame, but the student did not pay attention to them. The worker placed a sheet of paper with the contract in front of Chang'an and asked him to sign it, and now Lee was deciding how to identify himself. If for the Jade Scroll, he was Li Tai Bai, then for the new palace he could also come up with a new name. Based on his previous names, the young man began to draw with his brush his new name, which would be associated with the new palace. And this time, the guy decided to be the one whose name translates as Blue Lotus, and is sometimes even used to describe the eyes of Buddha, and this is Qing Lian. When Li looked into his palace of literature, he saw how the Taibai Palace grew and strengthened, but the Qingliang Palace did not move from its place in size. Now that two palaces inhabited the human body, it was becoming more and more difficult for the guy to dive into his palace. Chang'an sat in his room and analyzed that Qinglian's palace had not increased its literary qi at all due to the low sales of Liang and Zhu's book, and if this continued, his body might not be able to withstand it. The young man fell back onto the bed and thought about how the first author of the story about the lovers was able to make it popular. The system reminded its owner that the original author of the book, Liang and Zhu, was lucky enough to have his story noticed by other famous writers, which is why the work sold like hotcakes. This information didn't make things any easier for Chang'an because if he goes to the masters, he'll have to admit that Taibai and Qinglian are him, and the glory will go to Taibai, and this will make the situation worse, but Qing needs to be pumped up. Li thought that if he could improve the new palace and remain unnoticed, then Qinglian could be his strongest hidden trump card, and then the guy had an epiphany. The young man jumped up in bed again from the idea of making it so that people would not read the story of Liang and Zhu, but would pass it on by word of mouth. To implement his plan, Chang'an went to a brothel, where he found Madame Yan, whom he had once saved together with Zhang from the Longhu gang, and asked her for help, to which the girl happily agreed. Li stared at Yan because he was surprised at how quickly the girl agreed without even hearing the entire request. Yan thought that the guy had come to offer her to be his wife, and embarrassed, timidly began to answer that she agreed to become his wife, but Li interrupted her before she could finish. Chang'an thanked her and was glad that the girl would help him, and taking out a book, asked Yan to sing to people about the story of Liang and Zhu from his book, but at the same time so that no one would know that he wrote the creation. Yan was dejected by her own naivety, thinking that the master had come to her with a proposal of marriage. The guy noticed how sad the girl became and asked if something had happened to her, but Yan, abruptly returning the smile to her face so as not to show her dreams, said that she would do everything that was necessary because Li had saved her. One fine day, visitors were able to sit outside and Yan, sitting on the stage with a pipa, addressed the guests with the announcement that she would like to sing a love song for them. Gentle fingers touched the strings of the instrument, and the voice touched the hearts of those who listened to the song about the beautiful girl Intai who dressed as a young man went to school where she met Liang. The story continued with the young people falling in love with each other at first sight, and nothing could influence their feelings. But unfortunately at that time there could only be brotherhood between them because Intai was dressing up as a guy. The story would not have been tragic if the love of Liang and Yingtai had not been hindered by the girl's parents, who had already chosen a groom for her, and because the lovers had to be forcibly separated, Liang's heart could not bear it, and he died. When the wedding ceremony began, Intai rushed to the grave of her beloved, and the heavens opened his coffin, where the girl jumped to find herself in Liang's arms, and at that moment their souls turned into butterflies and fluttered away. At the end of the story, everyone who sat in front of the stage was crying, and these were both girls and men. One strong girl, whose tears were streaming down her face, slammed her fist on the table and threatened out loud that if she found the author of the story, she would hit him hard, and Chang'an was standing right behind her and heard this. Li had seen many different reactions to the works he had used as his own through the system, but this reaction with the threat of beating made him think that he had quite successfully and prudently made another name for himself. The guy looked at Yan from afar, touched by how tenderly the girl conveyed the story, also with the help of her velvety voice. Yan told the visitors that she took the story from the book Liang and Ju, authored by Qing Lian, and the girls immediately wanted to buy the creations for themselves and their sisters. After a few days, thanks to the book sales and the song that was heard, Chang'an felt the qi of Qinglian Palace began to increase, but still, compared to the other palace, it was not enough. At the Kunwen Bureau, meanwhile, the crowd was raging at the entrance, and the poor worker was apologizing for the fact that all of Liang and Ju's books had already been sold out, and he didn't know when new ones would appear. So he lied that they would appear in a few days. One of the cleaners snorted that you can't expect anything else from the girls, but at the same time he was surprised that romance novels have become so popular these days. And if he knew this, he would have written a better story himself and become famous. The boss, listening to these proud thoughts out loud, reprimanded the young man, asking if he really thought he was better than Qing Lian, to which the cleaner apologized and continued doing his job. The boss exhaled and concluded that at this rate, Qing Lian could become the second Taipei, and the man was more frightened by the losses they would suffer if there was no more order and they could not republish the book. The assistants announced that Mr. Qing Lian had arrived just as the boy was entering the office, and the boss felt alive again. The boss immediately suggested talking about increasing the copies of Qing's book at a reasonable price, and Chang'an agreed to listen to the man. The manager explained that they could start with 500,000 copies at once, and now nothing was required from Chang'an in terms of payment, and the guy would receive 30% of the total profit from sales. Li slammed his cup on the table so that the water rose to the top, and asked menacingly if they were trying to fool him into thinking that he was a newbie in the field of writing. The young man explained to him what he himself understood perfectly well, because what the man proposed would barely cover the expenses that the author himself paid at the beginning of sales, so it would be smarter for him to spend money and print it himself. The director tried to pull off the same scheme, assuring the author that investing and printing on his own was a rather risky business, since the books might not be sold. Li simply went to the exit saying that he himself understood perfectly well the risks, and also that other stores would offer more favorable conditions, and the unfortunate director shouted that he agreed to 30% of sales and not of profits. Having heard what suited him, Li agreed to his boss's proposal at the very last moment. As Chang'an was leaving the bureau, one of Zhang's comrades, dressed in the clothes of the Longhu gang, ran up to him. A logical chain immediately ran through the guy's head, that Sun wouldn't have come just like that, which meant that something had happened to their Longhu gang. Li appeared in the veterans' courtyard and was informed that they had completely taken control of the Longhu gang, but their boss did not want to disclose information about the deals with the prison warden Zhang Yingquan. As it turned out, Boss Longhu was right in the courtyard at that time, and the bag was pulled off his head so that Mr. Li could see for himself how the boss was behaving. The leader of the Longhu gang, despite exhaustion and numerous beatings, was still just as fierce and looked ahead when the bag was removed from him. A scoundrel is a scoundrel for a reason, so when the boss saw Li in front of him, he began to mock the fact that this insignificant brat was the main one among the warriors. Chang'an looked closely at the big guy and calmly replied that since the boss refused to talk, he would have to kill him. The thug did not expect such a sentence, but Li continued to tell his comrades that after the death of this man, they spread false rumors about his death, and after that, the authorities would definitely come to them to negotiate with the new leader of the gang. The leader was immediately finished off and blood was left on the floor, and Chang'an said that their goal was to become the leading force of the gang and not puppets. The boy turned to the brothers, giving them a choice of units they could go to, since there was now no threat from the Longhu gang. Chang'an explained that the first division was an opportunity to peacefully conduct his business, and the second was a spy division in which he would have to hide his identity and secretly control the actions of the Longhu gang. The young man also clarified that the soldiers will be able to get acquainted with everything in more detail when they make their choice. And some have already become truly happy that they will begin a normal life, which is how they showed their choice. The men voiced that if that were the case, then few would want to become spies, and Chang'an prudently said that he understood the difficulty of the job, but there would be 2 additional conditions for them. The first condition of the spy's work was to receive a reward depending on the quality of the completed mission, and the second condition was the creation of a school for the children of spies by Li himself, and those who were the most talented would be sent to the academy. Sun admitted that in such a case, one really needed to think about the children's future, and this was picked up by the others, praising Mr. Lee's kindness. Sun stepped forward and shouted to his comrades that they should remember how they should address their master, and they thanked their leader in unison. Chang'an proclaimed that from now on they would no longer act in the name of the Longhu gang, but would receive a new, worthy name. The guy proudly called the warriors the Han Dynasty, which appeared more than 5,000 years ago, and almost the entire world bowed before it, and it existed longer than any other. The next day, Zhang and Li's comrades were selling fruit on a stick and hot malaton at the market, while a bookseller was praising the excellent calligraphy technique in the book Liang and Zhu by Qing Lian. Opposite the book counter, two masters were talking about how the head of the Kunwen Bureau had gone crazy to start selling this cheap love story, and from an unknown author too, and eating words had at least Taibai. Chang'an heard the old men discussing how bad things were for the bureau director, which would soon allow one of them to close it, and then the guy realized that there was some truth in this, and Liang and Zhu had little spiritual aura. Li had an idea on how to speed up and improve the book sales process, and he showed up at Bailu Academy to meet Guan and An, and was delighted to see his friend from afar, wondering where he had disappeared to, while Chang'an was already getting a gift for his comrade. Li gave his friend his own book, but under a different name, and Anna was very surprised by this gift. The young man sat down next to Anne and said that since he liked the song from Eating Words, he decided to give something similar and opened the book in front of his friend, and was a little taken aback by the fact that the book was about a girl who dressed up as a guy, while Chang'an was giving another book to his friend Ziyu. Confused, An turned to Li and asked why he brought this book to him and not to someone else. Chang'an replied that he brought the book only thinking that he might like it. But in his head, he had a plan for An to show the book to the girl Kai, which would lead to more readers and sales. Guan decided to play a joke and asked Chang'an if it seemed to him that Anan looked a little like the girl from the novel, so the book seemed to him like Liang was Li and An was Zhu. Judging by Anan's sharp and rude reaction, there was some truth in what Guan said, which confused the guy. Li, without mockery, but wanted to show off and clarified that even if the role of the young man Lian was more suitable for Guan, since they and An often go together, and now no one was laughing anymore. Anan couldn't stand such words from his friends and kicked Chang'an's leg with all his might. Li fell to the floor away from his evil friend and screamed that he was going too far, to which Anne warned that if he didn't stop talking nonsense, their friendship would come to an end. Guan was already running to the other students, shouting out Li and Anya's conversation about ending their friendship because they would become lovers as a sensation, and showed everyone the book. Anan was now not even furious, but in a rage, shouting at everyone to shut up, and Chang'an sat and quietly thought about how he had not imagined the book's promotion this way, but it still worked out. Li's plan worked, and Anne threw the book that Taibai had given him on the floor, telling Kai that he thought she might like it. The young man was relaxing while taking a hot bath and was discussing with the girl that he did not expect such a sensation from this book among the ladies, and Kai added that her sister said that Mrs. Yan from the brothel on Tonglu Street began to sing songs based on this book. The name of the street, Tonglu, told Anya that Taibai lived not far from it, so some thoughts about this appeared in the young man's head. Kai recommended that the gentleman go to Yan's performance and possibly meet his Liang Shanbao there, which An did not quite understand, reminding the girl that this was a male role, and she asked again if Taibai was not the gentleman's Liang Shanbao, and began to splash water at Kai, joking with the girl when she managed to become so bold that she mocked her master. But the young lady still repeated the question whether the gentleman would go to the performance, and Anya, after thinking a little, answered that he would try. At the gate of Li's house, Yan stood waiting for the guy in order to discuss something with him about tomorrow's performance. Yan smiled and greeted the gentleman, explaining that she had come to ask if she could change some lines in the song about Liang and Zhu. The girl timidly handed the sheet of paper with the text she had changed to Chang'an and asked for advice. Li began to read the text carefully with genuine interest, moving his eyes along the lines, while Yan stood and watched the guy's reaction, waiting for his verdict. Having read to the end of Chang'an, I was delighted, even though the meaning was distorted in places, but it sounds very good. Li praised the girl's talent, and in all seriousness advised her to try her hand at the next county exam, which made Yan blush, thinking that the gentleman was flattering her. Finally, Yan expressed hope that the gentleman would come tomorrow to listen to the new version of the song, to which he replied that he would definitely come. While Li was saddened by the fact that such a talented girl was singing in a brothel in order to earn a living, and thought maybe he could help her somehow. At that moment, Linglong appeared behind him. The younger one raised a fuss because there was another girl there and started bombarding Li with questions about her. Linglong asked with displeasure if she and her older sister weren't enough for him, and Jiyin picked up on this and said that if he really liked that girl, he should find a matchmaker. Chang'an waved it off, saying that there was nothing between him and Yan, and that what the girls had already imagined for themselves was a misunderstanding. Linglong approached the young man, looked him in the eyes, and asked if he could promise that he didn't like Yan. And then, he did something stupid and didn't give any clear answers. Since Li didn't really answer, Linglong drew conclusions and shamed Chang'an for knowing that. The little one pushed the guy into the house, shouting that Chang'an liked Yan and she liked him. But he had Linglong and Zhiyin, so the young man was obliged to give her a child, and when Li asked the old woman to save him, she responded by fulfilling the younger one's request. No amount of persuasion or request had any effect on Linglong, and she pushed Chang'an onto the bed, terrifying the guy. The younger one took off her cloak from her shoulder and brought up the argument that her sister Zhiyin was very kind, and Mrs. Yan was talented in literature, and only Linglong had nothing, but by giving birth to a child for Li, she would become valuable to him. Chang'an decided to play along with the girl a little by getting ahead of the game and carefully grabbed her by the shoulder in order to perform one maneuver. The guy abruptly turned Linglong over onto the bed so that she ended up underneath him, which both scared and embarrassed the girl. Li leaned closer to the little girl and tenderly assured her that he didn't need reasons to love her, which Linglong didn't quite believe, since the young man knew her weak points. But Chang'an had his own plans for this, and he wrapped his sister in a blanket like sushi and said that she would sleep today so it would be safe for both of them, and if the girl tried to do something crazy, he would be very angry. The next day, there was already a crowd at the brothel, and many wanted to take a seat closer, which is why you could hear the swearing of those who were pushing. Some strong young lady pushed Anan, warning him that if he came that close again, she would get punched in the face. The girl pushed the guy quite hard, but Li arrived just in time and caught his friend so that he wouldn't fall onto the stonework. Anne was surprised to see Tai Bai there, as if Sai had not spoken to him about this in vain yesterday, and Li was glad that the meeting coincided. Suddenly, the Long Hu gang appeared, and the strongest of them asked the people to line up, and whoever would make a mess would have to deal with them. And the visitors were very surprised by both the gang and their changes. The leader again asked everyone to stand in line and stop pushing, because the sooner order is established, the sooner everyone will be able to enjoy the performance, and the people obediently fulfilled the request. Chang'an knew that it was Song under the mask, and was proud of how the gang had transformed, and he decided to raise his comrade's salary for such high-quality work. The houseworker personally approached Mr. Li and asked him to follow him, since Mrs. Yan allowed him to watch the performance backstage, and An was unhappy with the appearance of another chosen one. The guy exhaled heavily upon hearing his friend's discontent, which only made things even more tense, not to mention that at the moment everything had gone too far. Mrs. Yan sang for the visitors, and those who could see the chi that was sent to the author would notice how much of it was coming from people. At that moment, Chang'an felt his palace of literary Tao being nourished and was filled with gratitude to Yan, because if it weren't for her, the guy wouldn't have achieved such results. The joy did not last long because although Qinglian's palace became stronger, the situation did not improve. The Taibai Palace grew to unprecedented proportions and took over the tiny Qing Palace, and if they collided, a person would be in danger of dying. Chang'an was inside the spiritual world looking at the saints list, and was already, in a sense, preparing for the worst. Li understood that his life directly depended on the results that would be summed up at the end of the month and the results of the saints list. It was only worth thinking about something bad, and it was right there, because a new portion of Qi was directed towards the young man, which had previously been a joy, but now was bringing his death closer. Li screamed from the pain that was brought to him by the Qi filling him, which made it feel like his body was about to be torn to pieces. The Qi that came to the Taipei Palace accelerated the collision of the two palaces, causing the monument to crack and Li to start coughing up blood. The last hope was the spark of igniting the step technique, which Chang'an activated in order to expend Qi and balance what he received and gave. By releasing fire from a finger, the power was such that it was possible to burn someone alive or burn down a house. But Li fell exhausted, feeling that what he had done was not enough, and that he was spending many times less than he received. The poor fellow lay there, blazing with fire, and realized that if things continued like this, he would not have time to return to the physical world, and his strength was really leaving him. And at this last moment, the Jade Scroll appeared before the guy in order to save him and return him to reality. Chang'an's body moved and the scroll became brighter and brighter, forming something in the palace of literary Tao. When Li was already in reality, a huge monument dedicated to the book of Liang and Zhu grew in his spiritual world. The guy was lying on the floor of an empty room, barely able to breathe, and blood was flowing out of his mouth, indicating serious wounds inside his body. Apparently, thanks to the appearance of the monument, Li was somehow able to find the strength to rise, realizing that he was still alive. The young man was grateful that the Jade Scroll had once again extended his life, and moving with difficulty, Chang'an headed towards the exit. Opening the doors and holding on to them, Taibai saw Anna and Deputy Ji, who were afraid for their brother. Li fell into Annan's arms and said in a barely audible voice that he had received too much qi from the literary Tao and that his body could not withstand it. Anne held his friend's weak body, and Deputy Shu shouted for them to follow him to heal his wounds. But trouble came from where they least expected it, and a certain man appeared in front of the three men, hovering in the air from whom a purple glow emanated, and he said in a commanding tone that no one would go anywhere. Shu didn't expect to see the palace envoy himself in broad daylight, which left the man shocked. The envoy, smiling at the frightened faces, informed them that he had arrived to take Taipei to the capital. Shu understood that this person was much stronger than all of them, but he covered Annan with his hand, and Li asked the envoy for forgiveness, explaining that the tower master ordered the young man not to leave the county, and besides, he would not be able to cope with it now due to his injuries. The ambassador, enraged, causing the radiance around him to grow, shouted at his deputy that he did not dare speak to him in such a way, and Shu fell to his knees. Shu, overcoming the pressure that the unexpected guest was putting on him, turned to Annan and ordered him to take Li away from here. Anne did not hesitate, and holding his friend with one hand, with the other he used the technique of an unbridled whirlwind, spinning him around them. This manner of behavior and what Anya was going to do did not please the ambassador at all, and he called them all fools and decided to act more harshly. Anne and Li had not yet managed to move to another place, and the messenger sent 10,000 arrows at them, which pierced their hearts. Almost in front of the guys, Shu activated the shield technique, preventing the arrows from going any further, which was very difficult for him. The deputy's body also couldn't withstand this, but he held the shield as long as he could, so that Anne and Li could disappear from this place. Annan instantly followed Shu's order to get out of here and accelerated the vortex technique as much as possible. Almost before the students disappeared, Shu shouted for them to head to the academy where it would be safest. The next moment, the messenger was already standing in front of the deputy, tightly squeezing his throat, explaining that now Zhu himself would have to answer for Li's disappearance with his own life. Gasping for breath, Shu said that he had simply carried out his orders, to which the ambassador, squeezing his throat tighter, sent the deputy to hell. And indeed, some kind of explosion occurred between the two men, so much so that one might think that Shu had already descended into the underworld. But the deputy was still alive, but the ambassador was lying on the ground because after the explosion someone appeared and put his foot right on him. Above the messenger stood a pile of muscles in the form of a man who first asked whether everything had really gotten out of hand, where the guy came from, and since when he had managed to become the ruler of Zhushan. And if Shu looked at the master with tears of happiness, then the little bastard on whom his foot stood was horrified, realizing that Wang Tianan himself had arrived to sort everything out.